Okay, I guess we're going to get started. Is that too loud? It sounds very loud up here to me, but.
We can all hear you clearly.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, our small but dedicated in-person audience and hopefully larger audience perhaps on the live stream. My name is Christel Kesler. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs and a faculty member in the Sociology Department here at Colby. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, which is entitled Global Perspectives on Free Speech, and to moderate the discussion that we're going to have here. The Faculty Advisory Committee of the Goldfarb Center, including myself, wanted to put together an event this year in line with our freedom of speech theme that looked not just at free speech issues in this country or in one other place, but that really helped us all to think comparatively and globally about issues of free speech, to better understand, for instance, how different countries take different stances on free speech, some of the historical context of how those different approaches develop, and how those different stances might come into play on the global stage. My three esteemed colleagues are here to help us unpack these complicated questions. So I'm going to introduce all of them and then sort of open up some questions and turn the floor over to them. Jennifer Yoder, who joins us virtually tonight, is the Robert E. Diamond Professor of Government and Global Studies. She specializes in German politics and European politics more generally. Her widely published work focuses on topics as varied as the transition of Eastern European societies from communism to capitalism, contemporary relations between Germany and Eastern European societies, collective memory, and the rise of the far right. I've also had the pleasure of working with Jen on the Goldfarb Faculty Advisory Committee this year, and I'm delighted she was interested in organizing this event with me. Philip Jun Fang is my colleague in the Sociology Department. He is a visiting assistant professor of sociology. Professor Fang earned his PhD in sociology from Northwestern University just last year in 2021. He has already published a number of really terrific papers and is currently working on a book project entitled When China Meets Hollywood that explores global collaboration in the film industry. He's broadly a specialist in the sociology of culture and has been teaching courses at Colby on sociology of culture, creativity, Hollywood, and the role of China in the world. Professor Fang also has a fascinating history as a journalist, writing as a contributing columnist for outlets such as the New York Times China edition and Bloomberg Businessweek China edition. And he also works as a creative consultant to major Hollywood studios. So thanks to you for being here. And our third panelist is Nazli Konya, who is visiting assistant professor and next year to be tenure track assistant professor of government here at Colby. Professor Konya earned her PhD in government last year in 2021 from Cornell University. She specializes in comparative politics and political theory. Her work focuses especially on political protest and social movements in populist authoritarian regimes, such as Turkey and other parts of the world. And for the students in the audience, she's been teaching a range of really fascinating sounding courses here on political protest, racial and ethnic identities, and incarceration, in addition to political theory. So please join me in welcoming all three of our panelists tonight. And to start off, we're going to kind of give each of the panelists a chance to give us a sense of some of the major questions surrounding free speech in the parts of the world that you study, and if you will, perhaps some of the historical context for how those particular patterns developed. And we're going to start with Jen. So I can see her here, and you can see her here, so that's why
Very good. Thanks so much, Christel, for having us this evening. Thank you, Nazli and Philip, for agreeing to participate. And thank you for accommodating me virtually. So I work on Europe, and I would start off by noting something not very surprising to all of you, I'm sure, but that in contrast to the US perspective, which is highly individualistic, which would see any limitations on free speech as being harm to individual liberty. In Europe, in contrast, notions are more collectivistic when it comes to free speech. Hate speech, for example, is seen as posing harm to society, so there's more tolerance for state intervention to perhaps limit free speech. And certainly in the post-World War II period, after experiences with totalitarian and authoritarian rule, fascism and communism in the Cold War period, there is, of course, a great deal of importance placed on free speech, but that's also sometimes in tension with other important values emerging out of that experience with non-democratic regimes, such as human dignity, first and foremost, or honor, or equality, or tolerance, or non-discrimination. And so sometimes European countries do place limits on free speech when there's a danger of harm from racist or hate speech or incitement or discrimination. And this took a while after World War II. It really wasn't until the late 60s or 70s that some West European countries introduced laws against racial incitement or racial defamation or hate speech. And then not until the 1980s and 1990s that we saw the proliferation of Holocaust denial laws, about which I'll say more later.
Thanks, Jen. Philip, can we turn to you?
Well, yeah, so I focus on China. As you know, China has the most restrictive and the most sophisticated restriction on free speech, which is very unfortunate. But for me as a researcher, I'm very lucky to study this very sophisticated system. So when we talk about free speech, I think I want to focus on several different dimensions. One is internet, and the other is news and media. When we talk about media, I mean print and broadcast and motion pictures. So in China, there are over 1 billion internet users. So, and we have a lot of innovative platforms as well, including WeChat. So, but this digital access has been restricted by very extensive domestic laws. So you may know that there's a term in Chinese called the Great Firewall. So that is a combination of legislative actions and restrictions on the access to some information, and also censor some very sensitive topics. For example, since 2009, we lost access to YouTube, Facebook, Google, and Netflix. And then we also censor a lot of sensitive topics. For example, the 3 Ts, which means Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen Square protest in 1989. Sensitive topics on Hong Kong pro-democracy protests will also be censored, and certain religious organizations seen as cults by the state, such as Falun Gong, will also be censored. But it was not always like that. So I have some evidence tonight. So in 2008, when I was around your age, I was an angry young man in college. So I created this illegal pamphlet on this newspaper on campus titled 言论, which means speech. So I wrote about it. Universities have lost Mr. Democracy. I wrote about the rigged election on campus. I also wrote about French President Sarkozy met with Dalai Lama. All those sensitive topics, So back then I was not jailed. I was not even expelled. So it was fine, to talk about this kind of things, to be critical. But since the President Xi Jinping took over the government in 2012, I have to say, okay, so before President Xi Jinping took over this leadership, he was already very sophisticated. But after he took over this leadership, the system has become more sophisticated and more tightened. That brought a lot of problems, and then internet is people within China who are the internet users, and especially creatives. They always use the same word as suffocating to describe this kind of a free speech climate in China. So, and in 2017, the government implemented a new cybersecurity law, which requires social media to only reproduce or republish those media, news media, approved only by the state. So that kind of, it's very easy for a state to exert surveillance online and also maintain the narratives that will be desirable for the state. ironically, the Constitution of the People's Republic of China actually says something like this: citizens of the People's Republic of China enjoy freedom of speech, of the press, of the assembly, of association, of procession, and of demonstration. But in reality, we usually don't have this kind of a right, but it might be some privilege for certain people. So a few questions I want to ask, throughout tonight's discussion will be: what is free speech? Is there this ideal society where there's absolute free speech? Put differently, is there a society that has no censorship? What tactics does the government employ to restrict free speech? And who have the relative privilege of free speech? Can we bypass state censorship? If yes, and how? So we're going to come back to these questions later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. So today, I want to talk about free speech in the context of democratic decline or democratic breakdown that we see in populist authoritarian regimes of Eastern Europe. So I'll focus on 3 countries. One of them is Turkey, where I am from, and I have similarly sad nostalgic memories about attending student protests and not getting arrested, which is not the case anymore, under the governance of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party. I will refer to it as AKP. The second case I will focus on is Hungary, under Fidesz, that hold a supermajority in the parliament, as a third-term parliament, and its Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is now a new sweetheart of the American right. And the third country will be Russia under Putin, which we observe day by day, I assume. So there are different ways to describe these regimes. I used populist authoritarianism. We can also describe it as competitive authoritarianism, though these places are more authoritarian than competitive nowadays, or conservative nationalism. So what we are seeing here is an accelerating censorship. So, going back to Philip's questions, I think my focus will be mostly on how free speech is constrained by repressive state apparatuses. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. We see this transformation, this democratic breakdown in 2010s. And with respect to restricting free speech, there are 2 main frameworks that we should focus on. One of them concerns broadly the argument for state security, public stability, national security, national integrity. And the other one concerns preservation of a certain kind of life, certain way of life, customs, traditions, values, and especially the traditional family. So these are the 2 main axes of restricting free speech. Now let's start with state security. This concerns securing the peace and integrity of political body, and it's the main pretext for restricting freedom of expression. In Turkey, there are a number of laws that allow the government to restrict free speech, and the most important one is probably the anti-terrorism laws that date back to 1990s. So it's a set of laws that actually precede the AKP government, though the AKP government is applying it most generously and liberally right now. But when it was originally developed in 1990s, the main target was the Kurdish population, which still is, by the way, but like I said, it's just applied more broadly. Now, the problem with anti-terrorism laws is that the penal code is overly vague and broad. There are provisions such as making terrorist propaganda are banned, outlawed, but they are so less elastic to the extent that they can be applied to political cases across the board. Like I said, the main target is Kurdish activists, lawyers, national and local politicians, but this also includes the chairpersons of a major political party in Turkey, HDP, the People's Democratic Party, a pro-Kurdish party, who is 5,000 members are currently in jail and prisons. Alongside this anti-terrorism legislation, Turkish Criminal Code enumerates a very large list of crimes. And you might take a deep breath because I will list them. They include insulting the president, insulting the state, insulting the institutions and apparatuses of state, insulting the nation, inciting panic and fear among the public, inciting criminal activity, eulogizing criminal activities, inciting hatred and animosity. So as you can see, they are so vague. So for instance, when President Erdogan is asked questions about the number of journalists incarcerated, which we are racing with, competing with China on that, right? He answers that, well, they are not arrested for their journalistic activities. They are arrested for their terroristic criminal activities. Now, he keeps repeating this answer, right? And every time he repeats, that distinction actually disappears, the distinction between journalistic activities and criminal terroristic activities, because the journalistic activity itself is criminalized as long as, insofar as it gives expression to dissent. So this is how dissent is criminalized. Now, the other cases I wanted to mention, Russia and Hungary are also operating through very similar lines. You see very similar laws in Russia about disrespecting authorities. The dissident speech there is outlawed by any disrespect for society, government, state symbols, constitution, and the president, right? This is the commonality. You see that Putin gets also aggressive when he is insulted, when he feels insulted, which is basically, criticism against government. Okay, I'm gonna skip a lot of other laws, which I wanna come back, but what you see in Hungary is a similar rhetoric in terms of singling out critics who are considered internal traitors, who are in collaboration with foreign agents and lobbies, indoctrinating or disseminating false news. This hysteria also about disseminating false news, which again is basically anti-government criticism. So the commonality here is that an attempt to render nation-state, a critique that is based on attempting to render a nation-state vulnerable to foreign infiltrations, preventing the country from becoming a regional power, a strong economy, right? And hindering the nation, basically. So that's the commonality that unites all these three cases I mentioned. But the cultural political one, the second set of, the second axis through which free speech is constrained, is about cultural politics. And that's what you see as the panic around an open discourse about gender, sexuality, right? These topics are considered as certain gender ideology that are also caricatured as a form of leftist indoctrination, attacking our values, attacking our traditions, which should sound familiar to American audiences. So these are the two main axes that I would hope to continue to talk about.
Great, thanks. So we're going to spend a little bit of time touching on a number of different arenas in which debates about free speech play out, and some of them have come up already in the comments that you've made, and some of them haven't. And we're going to kind of just work our way through a number of these arenas. And we're going to start with higher education, not to be too navel-gazing, but we're going to start with higher education because in the United States, this is an arena in which a lot of debates about free speech play out. And so what I'm going to do here for each of these is kind of let whoever jump in who wants to say something, and we don't necessarily need to have each of you respond to each of these, but maybe we could, Jen, could we start with you again?
Yeah. And I may be more brief than the other two again, since this isn't an area of a great deal of controversy, at least in Western Europe, but some of that has to do with, there being stable democracies, and the European Union has some common principles and has even worked since the 1990s on sort of a European higher education area where they tried to come up with like a common definition of academic freedom. And basically that's research, teaching, and learning must be free of political intervention. But of course, in the individual countries, there may be some deviations from that. Nazli will probably talk about Hungary, which was the first kind of big cause for concern in the European Union space when in 2017, I think it was, the Central European University was forced to leave Hungary. And even some surprising places, like England, they haven't limited academic freedom, but there have been many politicians expressing concerns that conservative academics feel attacked in academia or in the classroom. In France, the Minister of Education voiced concern about post-colonial studies programs at French universities and has talked about Islamo-gauchism. In other words, the leftist ideological sort of focused programs that are speaking about the colonial past in ways that are embarrassing to the French nation. So yeah, maybe not as much going on in Europe. Eastern Europe may be a little bit different. Poland is also a place where conservative academics are expressing concerns that some of their more nationalistic or religious ideas have been attacked in academia. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Jen. Although I'd push back on the idea that being an established democracy prevents debates from becoming too heated in this, maybe. You know.
That's right.
Who wants to do either of you want to?
I can go. Okay, I will try to be quick with this, but this is really the main area that I'm sadly passionate about, because this is where actually, you know, the entire repression really boils down to academia and media. So in terms of academia, again, the two lines of inquiry I mentioned, protecting state security, national integrity, and family values, are the pretexts through which academic freedoms are curtailed. What happens in Turkey is a mix of prosecution, firing, and exile of critical academics. Maybe you've heard of this concept, academics in exile. There's thousands, hundreds and thousands of academics from Turkey are right now in exile because they did sign a peace petition. So in the aftermath of 2015 elections, the AKP government ended the ceasefire with the Kurdish freedom fighters, and they condemned the government's security operations that were taking place in southeastern Turkey, in Turkish Kurdistan. And they said, we will not be part of this crime. So soon after, there was a massive purge, which just got accelerated with the failed coup attempt on 2016. This is so much Turkish drama for you. You probably are not familiar with, you know, all these events. But with every new turn, with every new event, the AKP government finds a pretext to curtail academic freedom. So arrests and detentions are ordinary events, both for faculty and also for students, for protests on campuses. Then the other side of it is appointing pro-AKP regime loyalist presidents to universities, rectors to universities, and there were massive protests, for example, in my university at Boğaziçi just a couple of years ago. Well, okay, we have this purge and replacements in Turkey. What's happening in Hungary, as my colleague, Professor Yoder, also already mentioned, in 2018, one of the major universities of Hungary was altogether forced to exile, Central European University. But in the same year, remember what I said about gender ideology, in the same year, the Hungarian government effectively banned and eliminated all gender studies programs in the country, right? Effectively passed a decree seizing funding and withdrawing accreditation for the country's gender studies programs, citing low enrollment in programs and poor job prospects, which are familiar concepts to me, but it was done in a quite moralistic way, in a quite demonizing and vilifying way. A similar disaccreditation process took also place in Russia for Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences and the European University at St. Petersburg. They were discredited for some minor law violations. But again, for example, when you look at the the government officials' rhetoric, you see a great deal of disdain for gender studies programs, for liberal education that are provided in these universities, which are seen as foreign agents, quote unquote, and it has a legal basis, which I will discuss hopefully later. So in all these three cases, we have a mix of financial inducements and deprivation, right? The government withdraws funds, repressive policies that are quite liberally used, at least by the Turkish government, by incarcerating and forcing to exile academics, and replacement strategies, appointing loyalist, regime-supportive academics who are often undeserving in terms of their academic qualifications to very important positions in an effort to dismantle influential institutions that are likely to be dominated by people who are opposed to government. So you see a parallel, like a building of parallel infrastructures within universities and overall regulatory bodies, and you also see certain repressive policies that effectively take academics away from their positions.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to turn to you, Philip, with a different topic. Because you brought it up already in your introduction, but we'll hear a little bit from the others too about this. And this is media and social media, and just kind of thinking about, what some of the conflicts are that arise over that. Maybe thinking beyond just China, thinking about some of your work on sort of global collaboration and so on.
Yeah. So I have to say I'm not an expert of the internet censorship, but because I do research on the film censorship, I have to understand how censorship in general was done in China, right? And internet censorship apparently was the most challenging task for the Chinese government to handle. So I started to read a lot of literature from political scientists, our colleagues here. And so in the past 10 years, basically, the government has learned a lot of new techniques to handle the internet censorship. So I would say 10 years ago, the government censorship was on the internet censorship was very selective. So some Harvard professors on their research indicated that the government would allow actually some criticism of the government, but they would definitely silence and censored those things that can mobilize a collective action online. So all kinds of information online that try to mobilize protests, that will be silenced. But if you want to just say something bad about certain government officials, you might be allowed as long as not a president or something. So that was 10 years ago. But then gradually things got a little bit tricky. So another scholar, her name is Margareta Roberts. She has a book called Censored. Very good one about China's internet censorship. She used a very novel statistical analysis. I don't understand that, but I understand the mechanism she presented in the book. So she basically argued that our conventional wisdom on government especially authoritarian government trying to exert this kind of a total control on the internet was not right. In reality, instead, authoritarian governments such as Chinese government, they try to use a method that she calls porous censorship. So there are actually loopholes that they would allow some people to have access to certain information. But this type of censorship was done through three different technologies that she labels as fear, friction, and flooding. So fear, as it's quite easy to understand. If there's some very serious posts about the Chinese president or prime minister, of course, then they will be targeted specifically. So then there will be threats and punishments, right? But those kind of techniques will only be limited to those very serious posts online. The second one, friction, is more interesting for me. So when there's some information such as the student protest over 1989 on Tiananmen Square on YouTube, right? So it's not that difficult for Chinese citizens to get that kind of information. So the government will actually use a lot of blocks. They try to make it more difficult for the internet users to access to this kind of information. But it's not impossible. But because there's so much, you have to put a lot of more energy and time. Then sometimes just give up. You're fine with whatever information you can find on the Chinese domestic internet in the end. And last one is flooding. So especially we can see actually this kind of technology today during the pandemic and then the Russians invasion of Ukraine, I think. So there's a lot of information online. And then the government tried to control the narratives, right? So instead of censoring all those information already there, the government will just put a lot of their own narratives online to flood the internet, so that most regular internet users, they will just find the narratives promoted by the government appealing, and then they thought that's the major narratives on the entire world. So by using these three different strategies, fear, friction, and flooding, this type of porous censorship is actually more effective than the total censorship online. So I think the Chinese government has been very sophisticated in doing this. And then it's not just on the internet. We can probably also apply it to other types of media, including print and broadcasting and even in the film industry. And it's not just in China anymore. This type of technologies has been exported to other type of other parts of the world, and including the democratic societies where we can see government, or certain political parties try to hide or promote their information, or certain corporates can use their algorithm to control the narratives online to define whatever information they want you to see, right? So I think this is a very a serious issue, and then the Chinese government has been doing quite well, very sophisticated, but I'm worried that it's already everywhere, not just reduced to China.
Jen, can I ask you to maybe help us think through a little bit how, I don't know how to phrase this. So, it's hard to summarize what public opinion about, let's say, social media regulation is in the United States, because it's a very complicated issue right now. But if you could kind of give us a little bit of a sense of kind of public sentiment surrounding those kinds of issues in some of the European countries, is that something that you could speak to a bit?
Sure, definitely. Of course, that's right now, given the state of technology, I think the most important arena where there's this tension between freedom of speech and trying to reduce harm by racist speech or incitement, protect minorities from the kind of intimidation that historically has come from the authoritarian governments, but other corners as well. And so certainly Germany is the case that many people may be familiar with, that since World War II there has been not just a sensitivity but a prohibition on using speech or symbols or even wearing uniforms that are related to the Nazi party or Nazi ideology. And there's been also a great deal of regulation of print media when it comes to incitement, racist speech, or references to Nazism. And that, of course, is eventually going to spill over into social media. So Germany in 2017 passed a somewhat controversial and very significant, they call it a network law, where social media tech companies are required to police themselves. And so Twitter, Facebook, they have to publish quarterly reports of speech, the number of incidents that they have found and that they have taken down. And of course, that is very controversial, but it's been applauded by some governments that find this a handy, example to emulate. And for others, it is a slippery slope. But I should mention that the European Union is about to pass somewhat similar, a similar set of regulations to require social media companies to police themselves. So there's a great deal that's been happening. Germany definitely kind of sets the tone in some ways. And then the European Union is a handy vehicle for countries that may not want to take those dramatic steps to curb hate speech, racist speech, but are happy to sort of hide behind the EU and the developing regulations should they emerge.
That's a perfect segue to the next thing I think I'm going to ask you all about. So one of the reasons to think about different parts of the world, right, in comparative perspective, as we're doing here tonight, is to compare and contrast, try to better understand how and why these policies or practices are different in different parts of the world. But I'd also like to reserve some time here to think about the global nature of some of the debates about free speech. And obviously, European Union is one example of that on a kind of regional scale. So the question is, where within your areas of expertise do you see global forces coming into play in terms of the way that conflicts over free speech or policies about free speech unfold? And Nazli, maybe I'll throw that one over to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how much global it will sound, but I'm sure you will connect the pieces together. But while I'm speaking to you today about the ways in which freedom of expression is constrained in populist authoritarian regimes, I have a lot of resonances in my mind with what's going on in the United States right now, and I'm sure those resonances were already clear to you as well. So let's start with this concept of creating these, internal enemies that you find in the media, in academia, in gender studies, gender ideologues, right? These internal enemies. I just recently read, a couple of days ago, a speech Toni Morrison gave at Howard University in 1995. It's called Racism and Fascism. I do recommend you to read it if you haven't seen it. She there talks about, in 1995, how racism and fascism constructs an internal enemy to isolate, demonize, and criminalize it. So what we see today, I think, the attempt to restrict teaching and publishing on race, racial inequality, racism, racial bias, that backlash is the internal enemy, right? The critical race theory or 1619 project, whatever you want to call it, but that's the internal enemy that the global right is trying to attack, I think. And to explain this to you, I want to tell you something very quick, if I can do that. So, Russia is in American imaginary, it is the ultimate opposite of America, right? The most repressive and everything that represents what America is not. In 2012, Russian government passed, Putin signed a new law called Foreign Agents Law. So it basically means if you are receiving foreign funding, you need to, let's say you are a human rights organization and you are receiving foreign funding, you need to express this in all public-facing material you produce. So you show a video and imagine that you are the audience to that video. It ends with saying, this video was brought to you by a foreign agent. So what happens practically is that this law is used to shut down one of the most important human rights organizations in Russia. It's called the Memorial. And the Memorial has two branches. One is historical research arm and the other is human rights arm. And this historical research arm basically documents state violence from Soviet era, especially the Stalinist era, like gulags and everything, right? So to cut the long story short, it was shut down. And the prosecutor, in his reasoning to ask why to shut down the Memorial, he said, why instead of feeling proud of our country, which emerged victorious from a rightful war and liberated the world of fascism, are we supposed to feel shame to respect our past, which is presented as relatively dark? I mean, this sounds to me so much similar to how today Americans are pushing back against confronting the historical legacies of slavery and settler colonialism, and it's exactly the same to me. And it is funny because you see it in Russia, and you see the same wording in what James Baldwin would call racial innocence, right? Willful ignorance. So something to think about.
Thank you, Philip. I'll turn this one over to you.
So my research focused on the global film industry, right? So I try to, through my research, I try to advocate a broad understanding or definition of what censorship is. You know, that means also what the free speech is. So we usually think, you know, when in the media, we think about like, you know, when we talk about censorship, we always think about authoritarian countries, right, such as China or Russia. But some sociologists and other scholars in social sciences and humanities actually advocate censorship is actually everywhere, is ubiquitous. We think about it, especially think about discourse censorship. It's not something other people do. It's something we do every day, including me speaking now. I'm censoring myself, right? Because it's like it's a combination of what I want to say and what I could say here in this occasion. So in my own research, empirically, I have been observing the blurred boundary between state censorship and market censorship or corporate censorship. So censorship is not just about like, you know, the state try to repress your rights to speak or rights to create. Censorship for me, in my own research, is more about how the state collaborated with the creatives to make the movies together. And then that's why if we only focus on the movies, you know, made, and we try to call on those movies that have gone through censorship, we missed an opportunity to see so many other content you have seen on the big screen or small screen that has been censored by the corporate, by the studios themselves. You will never get a chance to see. So, so for me, like, you know, the Chinese the state censorship in China in the film industry is no longer something within China. It actually influences Hollywood, how Hollywood makes movie from beginning to end. So you know, for me, that's why I feel like, you know, if we think about restriction of free speech or creative freedom, we should not just look at the state, but look at where the power is, right? So all those corporates, those like the studios, the major 5 studios in Hollywood, they have been in power for 100 years, and how they try to collaborate with whatever markets and the states to make some lucrative products. So I think, you know, we should have a more broad definition of what censorship is. That's my take on it.
Thanks. I want to make sure we have enough time for audience questions. So I think I'm going to, at least for a first round of audience questions, see if take a first round of audience questions now. I have a million more things I could ask the 3 of them, but you probably all do as well. It's always like this. There's going to be a whole bunch at like 7:58. I can keep going. It's okay. Neil, go for it.
Thanks. This was also so interesting. You know, when you were talking, all 3 of you, I was thinking about the work of the famous sociologist of science, Robert K. Merton, who you know, many years ago proposed that that kind of the ability of information to spread freely is an institutional condition for the rise of science and for the success of science. And I'm wondering, in light of current conversations about whether some form of authoritarianism is kind of more efficient than democracy, whether in any of the countries that you study, in particular the more authoritarian regimes, whether there's any consideration of the kind of practical downsides of a restrictive regime. That is, you know, does it impede the growth of science? Does it impede, certainly impedes the development of civil society, but does it impede the growth of the universities? You know, will it put the nations at a competitive disadvantage to have these restrictive knowledge regimes?
Yeah, I mean, I think you are right, and I think we will see the repercussions, we will see the outcomes, especially in terms of scientific progress. The academics I've been talking about are mainly in social sciences. They are more, you know, their work is more political explicitly, right? But right now, the university I studied has fewer academics than the number of academics who are currently incarcerated. And I'm not even talking about the academics who are in exile, right? So of course there will be a negative impact in terms of both scientific progress, but also the students we educate in colleges, where there was a notion of liberal education where you could be able to talk about the Armenian genocide, which you nowhere else hear about, right? So yes, that will change, and I think there will be studies about it within the next 10 years. The phenomenon I described is a phenomenon of the last 10 years. 10 years from now, we will see that.
Well, I would second that. Definitely, I think the academic culture in China, I haven't been back to China for over 2 years because of the pandemic, but my colleagues have, expressed their concerns with their academic freedom, and especially the scientific progress within China. And creatively, all my filmmaker friends and journalist friends, they just don't know how to make movies and do journalism anymore in the current framework. So I think that definitely has a lot of downsides, in the long run. But in the short term, it's effective, and you can get a work done, and then you can make a lot of money, if you follow the order of the state, or if you collaborate with the state. But in the long run, I can definitely see the more downside.
If there are no questions, yeah, sorry.
There's one more question here.
Sorry. You mentioned when you were saying that the Turkey government has abolished some gender studies department. I wonder, and you said that they based that on a beautifying and moralistic premise. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, well, the gender studies are abolished in Hungary, but that doesn't mean that there's not a crusade against them in Turkey either. So the discussion that's taking place in these populist authoritarian contexts, I think, are not so different from the debates that are taking place within right-wing circles in the United States, or right-wing circles in Brazil, Peru, in other distant parts of the world. The main argument is that we need to protect the children. The children are indoctrinated to become transgender, to become homosexual, and that is an attack on our traditional family that should take place between a man and a woman whose gender are already determined by their biological composition, constitution, etc. Right? So the moralistic argument there is that we need to raise, this is Erdogan's words now I'm quoting, we need to raise pious generations. Or in Orban's words from Hungary, we need to raise patriotic generations with a consciousness of their nation and their family. So it is basically, Christian values are under attack in Hungary, just as much Christian values were attacked in Peru or Brazil, just like Islamic values are under attack in Turkey. So the religion changes, right? It doesn't matter. But the core is the traditional family between a man and a woman and children. To complicate the picture, at least in the United States, I don't have the numbers from Turkey. But this traditional family, when you think about, these, so the free discourse on gender is packaged as something that is against children's interests, right? And the family is the safe space. It's the sanctity of the family. The family is also the place where children are most abused, right? 30% of all children, of all child sexual abuse cases come from family. 50% for children under 6, right? 90% of child sexual abusers are somebody those children know. 60%, and I'm not making up these numbers, 60% is by a person whom the family trusts. So this is actually the family that we are talking about, practically speaking.
And currently, right now, in several states in this country, you know, these can't say gay laws that are now affecting what books can be in elementary school libraries or in classrooms. So, you know, this tension between, on the one hand, freedom of speech, and on the other, values as being prescribed by a state or a party or a school board that are family values or national values. I mean, this is not just in authoritarian countries. This is right here. So.
Okay. So I was kind of thinking about how we think about freedom of speech in a sort of westernized context. And I know in Professor Yoder's class last year, this is Emily, by the way, how we talked about the student movements in Germany and how effective they were in kind of changing the culture, and how we talked about earlier, like institutions, educational institutions being a stepping stone in gaining more free speech. So I didn't know in like Eastern Europe and Turkey and Hungary and in China if there's a possibility of the same student movement or student kind of uprisings in changing the free speech kind of dynamics, or if that was more specific to Germany and like more Western values.
Do you want to say something?
I'm thinking still. I think, you know, throughout history in China, 1989, that was the best opportunity for the student group, you know, to push forward a democracy agenda. And then it was cracked down, and then it became, you know, a tragedy. So many students were killed on the Tiananmen Square. So I think since then, you just lost opportunity to have this kind of a agenda, you know, of a free speech anymore in China. And I'm a little bit pessimistic here because I don't see in the following decades, you know, there will be an opportunity for any groups in China to push forward such an agenda. But again, as I think, you know, many people will be fine with whatever freedom they have at the moment on the internet or in everyday life. But you know, people in academia, in the creative industry, in science, they are the elites, I would say, because they know there are other, you know, societies where freedom, free speech might be a right, but in China, where it's just very limited. So they can compare, and then they will feel a little bit suffocated.
Can I say something too? Emily, this is a great question. And I'm glad that now I have the opportunity. When I talk about Turkey in panels like this, it gets really grim because I'm very angry, as you hear from my tone. But then it also sounds like it's the end of the world and there's nothing good and, you know, it's just authoritarianism all the way down. Yeah, the government is very authoritarian, but there is an incredible energy that you find in the youth, incredible courage, incredible humor in the midst of all this darkness. And that's led by the youth, that's led by the student movement. And that is very important. You see every now and then in 2013 Gezi protests, thousands, millions of youth, right? In every university protest, even though they are detained from their houses at 5 a.m., right? And they are arrested for no good reason. You still see students going out into the streets, taking over, lectures, panels, protesting politicians. So you do see that enormous courage and enormous commitment to democratic values, to free expression and free assembly. So that's very important. And when you think about rights, now this is my democratic theory persona, when you think about rights, you might think them as things that are granted by the state, by political authorities, or you might think about rights as things that are performatively exercised by people who are denied those rights. Now the youth in Turkey is that subject that is denied the rights. They nonetheless exercise those rights by their courage and presence.
Anybody else have questions? We can just maybe follow up with that great question with another question that just kind of wraps things up and kind of thinking about the future. So what kinds of questions do you all think are going to be, in the relatively near term at the forefront of debates in various parts of the world or globally? Do you think we'll see movement in the direct, it seems like the kind of tone of what you've all said is there's been this kind of, in the relatively recent past, movement in the direction of restriction. Do you see that continuing? Do you see there, being some kind of turn in a different direction? Just sort of what are the prospects? And we'll just kind of wrap up with that question. Jen, do you want to start?
Yeah, it seems that, with all of these different platforms and ways of sharing information and kind of troubling traditional ideas about things, that there has been, certainly in Europe, the United States, and I'm sure, in every corner of the globe, a reaction, and that is a desire to fall back on a very simplistic, feel-good, kind of monolithic story about who we are and what our past has been, what we stand for. And I see this tension, it's not the first time, but it seems to be bubbling up just about everywhere between, those who want to sort of complicate things with a more complex, nuanced, pluralistic, whatever you want to call it, critical set of ideas about who we are or what has happened in the past and what it means, with that more reactionary, wait, we want to put a good face on things. And of course, Russia lately has been in the news with this, talk about denazifying Ukraine and, making sure that only positive sort of interpretations of Russia's past are permitted. But this is happening everywhere. It might seem, exasperating or surprising, but it probably shouldn't, right? Because we've got all these ways to trouble things, to make things more, nuanced and interesting. But that can be very threatening to certain bases of power.
Thanks. Philip, do you want to take that one? What does the future hold?
Well, I want to talk about the technology because I feel like the future now depends on the technology. So China has been pushing forward, and along with other Australian countries, they pushing forward a concept I found fascinating, even though I'm not an expert, which is cyber sovereignty, right? So for them, the internet itself is a national security problem, right? So you have it kind of opens discussion, for us to think about even the internet should be open or global, or should be more closed and state-based. And for now, I think Russia just followed China's suit, wanted to have a more state-based internet, and then the state, it's so easy for the state to exercise this digital surveillance and then to maintain control and the information control and maintain stability. So, and I think it's just becoming such an important issue. We have to think about, what the future looks like on the internet. how should we approach technology, right? And I think these are the questions that would define this century and then the relationship between China and the West.
Thank you. Nazli, the future? Final words?
I do agree with, I think, a lot of things my colleague Professor Yoder said. This is a moment, and I'm sure you are all feeling the gravity of the moment, but it shouldn't, I think, be so depressing, even though lots of the things I said today were depressing. But I think what I see in my American students is that there's this tendency to exceptionalize not only the good things, but also the bad things, right? Every nation state has troubles in their history, and they have troubles in their present to confront those troubles and their afterlives. My people have the Armenian genocide, which we never talk about, right? There are all these, Russia has their gulags, right? Americans have slavery and colonialism, and they are continuing, and their afterlives, to put it shortly and mildly, right? So an attempt to avoid these uncomfortable subjects is not unique to the United States, but it doesn't mean that it's acceptable, right? It should still make us angry, but we should also have this conversation with other places that now I'm talking as Americans, that we think that we are so different from. Not, right? We are not different from all these other places that I've been talking about today. Of course, there are differences. We should not flatten out those differences, but there are very important similarities from which we should be learning and from which we should be deriving strength, because there are also people who are pushing back against those backlashes, right? So there's a lot to learn from different contexts, not to get drowned in our despair here either.
Thank you. Great. We'll end on that optimistic note. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this panel, for coming.